Okay, welcome everybody. I want to get us started because we have a full program planned, and we have some more guests that are going to be coming and joining us from Bay Peace, Better Alternatives for Youth, but they weren't able to come across the bridge until the young people got out of school. They're stuck in traffic, so these spots with the pink cards are for them when they get here. And we're going to actually dive into our panel, and then when they do get here, we'll pause and let them start us off with kind of thinking through a collective definition building of what militarism is. So my name is Adele Fales-Carpenter. I'm faculty here in Women's and Gender Studies. This is part of our Women's History Month programming. So I want to thank my Women's History Month co-chairs, who are Ligia Lumsden and Shella Cervantes, and then also concert and lecture series here at City College, which helped fund bringing out our guests, who I'll introduce shortly. But our talk tonight is Drop the Mic, which stands for Military Industrial Complex, Feminist Leadership Against Militarism. And before we start, and especially starting a conversation about militarism, I want to acknowledge that we are on land, and the place that we're gathering is land that was traditionally inhabited by and stewarded by the Ohlone people, and that it's occupied land, and that we are living in a settler colonial society, and that part of the legacy that we have to contend with when we're thinking about how to build justice and how to combat militarism is that we also need to be thinking through the legacy of settler colonialism as well. But to start, just to express gratitude for our ability to be here and gather on this land today. So I'm going to do quick introductions of the folks who are here, and then we'll hear from Bay Peace when they get here. We have organizers from About Face, Veterans Against the War, and Gabriella USA here. And let's see. First, I'm going to introduce Crystal Tubles. Crystal is an Oglala, Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne woman who reminds us that what matters is what we fight for, not what we fight against. Crystal is a new member of About Face, having joined in August 2018. She served in the U.S. Army Reserves for 8 years and was deployed to Kuwait in 2009. Crystal is new to the anti-militarism conversation, but has significant knowledge and experience in environmental justice, indigenous sovereignty, and social justice campaigns. She works to decolonize the approaches and methods that we utilize within movement spaces, and she's one of the national co-directors of the Drop the Mic campaign. And Brittany Ramos de Barros is a combat veteran who served in the Army Reserve for 7 years as a logistics officer and psychological operations officer. She has a strong record of leadership across private, government, and nonprofit sectors with an emphasis on community engagement, narrative strategy, and continuous improvement practice. She recently made headlines for her vocal opposition to war profiteering and accepted a role as Drop the Mic campaign co-director at About Face Veterans Against the War. And then directly to my right is Pixie Castillo. She's the National Deputy Secretary General for Gabriella USA, a national alliance of Filipino women's organizations spanning 10 organizations across the United States. Gabriella USA is also one of 13 international chapters of Gabriella around the globe. Pixie is a graduate of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, yay SFSU, and communications coordinator of the Filipino Community Center in San Francisco, California. She helped lead national campaigns, including the successful cancellation of NBC's Mail Order Family and Baba Ako, which promotes the unity of women against the macho fascist Trump Duterte regime. So we're also going to be joined by Leilani Salvador, who's a teaching performance artist that utilizes a community-based approach, uplifting voices of marginalized youth and women in order to challenge dominant ideologies and ways of being. She's the director of Bay Peace, Better Alternatives for Youth, and founder of Wage Art, Women and Girls Empowered to Address Real Truth. She leads events, educational programs, and artworks that center healing and social justice. And then we're going to have 7 young people who do work with Better Alternatives for Youth, Bay Peace. They use popular education and peer education methods to address militarism and to highlight the need to build alternatives. And they do work primarily with young people in Oakland. The young people who are joining us tonight are Erickson Amaya, Alejandro Manzanares, Arvil Persons, Marcos Acosta, Jonathan Ramirez, Maria Avila, and Ana Mendez. Before we start, I do want to acknowledge that we are recording tonight. So thank you to Susan Bruckman for agreeing to record this event so that more people can hear and benefit from the analysis that's being developed and shared here. And so I want to just invite our guests tonight to start off by sharing a bit about your work. What you do, what the organizations that you work with do, and what brings you here tonight. And maybe we can start with Brittany, since you're on the far end. Sure, thank you.
Okay. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Brittany, pronouns she, her. I feel really honored to be able to have stepped into a full-time role as an organizer after working in other capacities, around this as my passion for not that long, actually. I've been involved in social justice work for what feels like my life, but much more actively over just the last few years, and didn't speak out vocally about militarism publicly until November 2017. And I came back from war in 2013 and really struggled to get on my feet, and was so, I think I had a lot of moral conflict and discomfort, to put it lightly, about what I had participated in, how differently my experience had been compared to the way I watched the war be sold to the American people, and had developed a real complicated solidarity with the Afghan people that I saw really struggling against, what very quickly became clear to me as organizations and violence that had been propped up and created by our government. And I think we can get into more about that later. But it was painful to come back and to watch people talking about the liberation of Afghan women, to talk about the Taliban in this very simplistic, demonizing way, not to apologize for the tactics of the Taliban, right, but to see the very intentional ways that was being put forward as an intentional narrative to justify our own violence, right, and to whitewash our own violence in that space. And so for a really long time, I turned to focusing on anti-poverty work and anti-racist work here, and was constantly venting to my friends, right? We need to be talking about the military. We need to be talking about the fact that we're still at war. People are acting like we're not at war, right? And I was constantly saying that just to my friends, to my family. And then one day, I finally watched how the nationalist narratives that are used to whitewash our own the roots of this country, right? That the military that we are taught to worship and to celebrate was actually formed in response to indigenous resistance, first and foremost, right? And that has always been the case, that the military has been used in response to any kind of people's movement or resistance that has gained real power and real traction in this country. And the complicated stories that we've created in our national set of mythologies that we tell each other, right, over the years about what this country means and what it means to be American and what it means to be in the military. And I watched all of those narratives be so powerfully translated to be weapons against anyone who was standing up against police brutality, against anyone who was standing up for women's rights, against anyone who was standing up for LGBTQ plus rights, right? Against all of these immigration. You can't the environment, right? There's not a social justice movement that you can point to in this country that has not had nationalist narratives used as a weapon to delegitimize the efforts of those people, right? And to spin them as unpatriotic, as not the right way, as whatever those things are. And so that is what led me into doing this work more explicitly and to talking about the importance of carrying an anti-militarism lens in at the intersections of the other justice work that we do. And that led me to About Face Veterans Against the War and to this campaign. And I'm handing off to Crystal, and we'll let her share a little bit more about those pieces, and I'm sure we can talk more about them as we go.
Well, Peveshev, Mene Wostat Nanehev. Good evening. My name is Crystal Tubals. As Adele mentioned, I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. So I was born in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and was raised in Montana on the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation. Which actually, when I'm thinking about these questions of like why I'm here today, that's really what brought me here today, was just my experience enlisting in the military and getting out of the military, but really looking deeply at what that means to be a Native American woman, knowing what the US military did to my people, knowing the genocides and the firsthand stories that were passed down from my grandparents to my parents to me, and probably to my future children. And then even just acknowledging that, the woman I was named after, she actually survived the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is only 2 generations removed from me. And so that's not history. That's still very present. And so trying to reconcile my history and my stories and my family's stories with enlisting in the military and taking part in what I later found out to be imperialism, and what I later found out I was just a tool in this larger machine that was attacking and impacting other indigenous peoples all over the world. And so that was really a very complex, to say the least, issue that I was trying to navigate within myself. And part of what brought me to About Face, though, is, I was at Standing Rock as well, and I had been there for 4 months organizing on the ground and doing things, and there was the whole veterans mobilization, which I was not a part of. I was on the ground already organizing. I had been there for 4 months, and by the time the veterans mobilization came, I was already, off and, organizing a national campaign to help support and bring resources into the camp. And so I wasn't there for that, but I remember how it made me feel, because I had always had this feeling of feeling guilty or feeling shame around being a veteran, having deployed. And it wasn't something that I wanted to consciously tell people, and especially in social justice movement spaces, is I didn't want to acknowledge that. And I didn't want people to know that. But in all actuality, what I was finding is it was actually one of my biggest assets, is the fact that the indoctrination that we go through helped me actually understand strategy, action logic, tactics, campaign development, all of those things, because I also was in logistics. And it was actually a really smooth transition from the military over to organizing. And I still felt guilt about that, though, and I still felt that. And then later on, through my connections at Standing Rock and other people in other organizing spaces, I got introduced to About Face. And I didn't want to participate in what they were doing, and I didn't even want to be around other veterans. But one of my mentors, I really look up to him. He's from Hawaii, but he had told me, no, it's a good group. They're very conscious. You should just try it out. Come, I'll be there. And so I agreed to it and actually went, and my very first time consciously choosing to be around other veterans was actually, I jumped in and started to actually facilitate at that gathering. So I didn't just participate, I actually went in and was facilitating pieces of the training in itself, which, as Brittany will tell you, that's kind of indicative of how we run things, is we just jump in and do it. And but I remember being there and just being feeling so comforted by all of the other veterans that were also thinking the same thing I was, and that were also dealing with this duality that exists within our identities. And it actually started this long process of me really acknowledging that I come from a warrior culture. My people were known for being warriors. We acknowledge that and we actually hold them up. But there's a very clear difference between being a warrior and serving your people and looking out for the interest in the well-being and the protection of a way of life, of your elderly, of your children, and of a community, versus being a soldier, which is blindly following orders and feeding into imperialism. And so I had to take that journey into shifting and working with myself and healing back into that warrior role, which actually led me applying with About Face and now Brittany and I are both the co-campaign directors with About Face. And then also just really quick About Face, I know we keep referencing it and I didn't go into exactly what that is, but I always explain us as like really simply as we're a national network of veterans, conscious veterans that are anti-war and anti-militarism, but work at the intersections of all the different social justice movement spaces that exist. So you will find us in many different spaces that aren't specific to anti-war and anti-militarism, but we always bring that lens with us when we're in spaces. Thank you.
What brought us here today, right? Well, I got involved in organizing with Gabriela through student organizing at San Francisco State, but I really was pushed to join in on activities from my community work. So I started in the South of Market when I started going to school at SF State in 2011. I started volunteering at a Filipino bilingual after-school program at Bessie Carmichael. And so it was really there that I walked a student home because their family couldn't pick them up, which is like a regulation, like you have to have someone sign out because they're younger than a certain age. And so we walked from Bessie Carmichael, the middle school site, which is in 4th and Harrison. If you're familiar with downtown SF, that's like the freeway is like right across the street. There's like a Whole Foods, there's several developments, newer developments in maybe the past 5 to 10 years, right? That have gone up around this school that had been historically been serving Filipino bagong dating students or newcomers. It was a place where they could go to kind of in the 70s, right, get assimilated before getting put into mainstream schools. And so there's like a deeper history there. But I walked a student home from program, and we walked from the Metreon, passing Westfield, going towards Union Square, where they lived kind of by the, I think it's like the Stockton Tunnel that's out there, right? So we walked through that and we saw all of these ads, all of this like hyper gentrification, what they're calling it now, right? As well as like luxury goods stores. And we had been talking on the way there of like, oh, how come the program couldn't afford basic equipment for outdoor play? We're down to one basketball and just regular things like that. And walking through there really pushed me to really be more critical about how did my people or Filipinos here in the U.S. Get to this crossing grounds, right? So I started asking more questions, was introduced to the League of Filipino Students at San Francisco State University. And so I was there, I started like getting more politicized, also facilitating, eventually becoming the chairperson there, and also doing campaigns there. And the thing that was really critical at that point is that LFS is similar to Gabriela, is not just like one organization that's here. It's actually connected to a larger movement, a larger liberation movement happening in the Philippines. And so being able to go connect with the chapters in the Philippines and go on an exposure trip there to really integrate with the most marginalized sectors of society, to really see how much our people over there are being neglected, and really putting into perspective how intimately U.S. imperialism affects our families and our lives. So much that for me and my family, we're also a military family, was able to migrate here because my father joined the U.S. Navy in the Philippines. Also kind of diving deeper into that, and in what other countries can you join a U.S. like arm of the military in a country that's not the United States. And so even going deeper into that. So after I graduated from LFS, I started doing women's organizing with Gabriela USA. And so kind of getting a bigger lens. So no longer just focusing on youth and student issues, but even bringing youth and student issues into the larger context of women's issues, which cut across all sectors of Philippine society. So really seeing how migration, how the issues of militarization, how corruption and even the war on drugs, right? How it affects all of us, and what are the ways we really can move forward from in our analysis, but also how do we really organize to become really a united front in terms of really destroying the system, right? And so all of that is coming from that short walk from 4th and Harrison to the Stockton Tunnel. Yeah.
Well, Brittany, Crystal, and Pixie, I want to thank you for being here. 2 of you traveled from out of state to be here, and Pixie, you do really critical work in neighborhoods directly surrounding the college here, and so it's really an honor to have you here tonight and as part of the Women's History Month programming. And I ought to have acknowledged that tonight's programming is also co-sponsored by Philippine Studies and Project Survive. So. My next question is kind of about the framing of tonight's discussion, feminist leadership against militarism. So one of the premises of Project Survive, one of the co-sponsors of this event, and part of what we teach in the Politics of Sexual Violence class, which is a large number of the folks you see here tonight, is that sexual violence has political, social, and psychological causes. And we try to examine how sexual violence is upheld by and practiced in hierarchical institutions, like the military. And then we also look at how sexual violence socializes us to actually accept and normalize hierarchy on a broader scale. So we opened up today's discussion around the intersections between militarism and feminism. And we think of feminism as an effort to end sexist domination and hierarchical abuse. But it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, that term. And I think one of the things complicating the conversation around combating militarism and using feminist approaches to that is that during the global war on terror, so this kind of last period of US war making, we've seen violence against women be used to justify particularly the US occupation of Afghanistan, something you already kind of brought up, Brittany, but also used as a justification that's been kind of recycled again and again to shore up the legitimacy of US imperialism in the Middle East and South Asia more broadly. And so my questions for you are, why is it important for people who care about gender justice to foreground a commitment to combating militarism and imperialism in our politics? And what does that look like? Maybe also, what does it not look like? And then can you share in what ways questions of gender justice have been important to you in your work combating militarism? And in what ways the framing of feminist leadership against militarism feels useful or maybe not useful? And any of you that want to start are welcome. We'll take about 4 minutes for each person who wants to respond, and Diamond is keeping time.
Okay. So I think the easiest to cut to the chase, right? Of why does an anti-militarism lens matter? I wish we had had the chance to do our exercise first about building a definition of militarism together, and just so I could also get a sense of where everybody's at in the room and kind of where you're coming from. But we will get to that later, but in the meantime, let me just read the definition that I'm working with really quickly. And it's on the page that should have been passed around as well. So a system of political, economic, and social philosophies that prioritizes and glorifies the expansion and aggressive use of government violence to further government interests. A culture embracing militarism is often marked by passive belief in the intrinsic value or necessity of war, prioritization of military practices, values, and knowledge, and powerful national mythology that centers military success. So I don't think I probably need to go into all of the ways that those are emblematic of American culture, mythology, value systems. I think when we look at politics, one of the things that motivated me as a young person who was really justice-minded was watching the news and being somewhat political and watching pundits, right? Like interview politicians, and the politicians asking questions about foreign policy, and the politicians being like, well, of course you don't understand, you never served. And that constantly being, for lack of better terms these days, a trump card that was always thrown as not an actual answer to the question. But built in that, right, is this glorification that military knowledge or anything that's military grade, right, even in products, is inherently good and inherently valuable. And efficient and all of these things, right? So those are some of the more subtle components that we think of when we think of a culture that is built around like an ideology that celebrates militarism. But when I think about the intersection with, why does it matter? Could we be really amazing feminists without holding an anti-militarism lens? For me, two things come to mind. Philosophically, I think that you can't understand patriarchy divorced from an understanding that patriarchy is founded on commodification and exploitation, right? And when we think about patriarchy as a system of power, right, organized around the prioritization of certain values, and then mechanisms for enforcing that power, commodification and exploitation are the ways that value and power is traded and is upheld. So an example of that, right, is the commodification of femme bodies, the commodification of sexuality, period, right? Of all of these different, even of identity, period, right? Of blackness, of all of these things, like building scales. And then, when we think about an economic system based around ableism and all of these things, these are all connected to a system that is structured around control and commodification and exploitation. And we see that in the land, right? Economically, we see that in our exploitation and extraction economy, and that shows up in imperialism, right? And that we fight these wars, and we have 800 military bases around the world, while the rest of the world combined has about 75, because we're maintaining our ability to continue extracting from places in order to maintain our economy, which is based around dominance and commodification. Right, so I don't think you can separate, the system of patriarchy from that. And when we think about that obviously, there's an immediate connection, right, to imperialism. But then there's also the more subtle connection of understanding that sexual violence as a phenomenon that shows up for many reasons, as Adele already mentioned, but particularly is organized around a way to violently enforce a particular dominance or power, right? A way to assert control over bodies that are not yours, or land that's not yours, or whatever, right? Like, those things are fundamentally connected. It's the same value set that says I am allowed to take and exploit whatever I want without consent, without respect, and so forth. So I think you fundamentally have to connect the dots in order to have a thorough analysis that is truly liberatory, and truly sets us up to imagine what an alternative would be that it would avoid those things. And I think an example of why that's necessary is when we think of alternatives that are promoted as successes in the current scope of work, right, in justice movements. You see articles that recently came out that celebrate almost that more than half of women, that more than half of the CEOs and executives in defense contractor companies are women. Yay, right? Liberation. Now women are bosses, but they're bosses of organizations that are generating massive numbers of bombs to bomb Black and brown people all around the world, right? Is that liberation, right? And then we bump into complicated things with the trans ban that's happening right now, right? And bump into things where I'm grieving because I know people who are going to be impacted by that right now, who are soldiers, right? And there's a very real cost to that. And so then we ask ourselves, is it our goal for more people to serve in a toxic institution that is fundamentally designed to murder people of marginalized identities, right? fundamentally, that's what we have to understand. So I think what a lot of people would describe, right, as neoliberalism is fun. Like the most obvious indicator of neoliberalism is these justice analyses without a lens that connects to international struggle, without a lens that connects to the impact of imperialism, right? And that's where we end up with things where it's like, yay, more women and more femmes are in these institutions that are fundamentally oppressive, right? As opposed to something that holds the analysis that actually we're trying to tear down a value system of militarism. And that doesn't mean that we have to disrespect individual women soldiers, but it does mean that we need to hold an analysis that understands that that system is still a system built around reinforcing white supremacist patriarchy power, like patriarchal power.
So the question is, like, why is it important for people who care about gender justice? And I mean, I can't speak for anyone else except for myself, and why it's important to me to continue that work. And that's really around my identity as a Native woman still. Everything that I do always refers back to these intersections of my different identities that I carry. And right now we have this phenomenon in Canada and the US, like missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? And that's not something that just like came out of nowhere. That was something that was very like systemic. It was intentional, and it's for a reason. And even like going back to Columbus, landing and introducing STDs, introducing sex trafficking, introducing pedophilia, and introducing this idea that brown women are not humans and that we are actually just like commodities and we are for pleasure and for profit. Like those were concepts that were introduced. And they were introduced in a very intentional way, to the point that like we can now trace those ideas of that back to that point in time. So like it was intentional, and I think that's important to remember. And so for the work that I do, that was military based. And even just looking presently, as Brittany referenced earlier about the military and the way that it's structured and the way that it looks now was designed around Indigenous resistance. Where we see some of the largest military installations are where we had the largest populations of Native people. And so that's where the bases were, because that's where the uprisings were and that's where the resistance was. I'm actually just gonna give them a minute to settle, because I'm getting sidetracked. Welcome. Yeah, so just going back to that question is like why it's important. That's why it's important to me, is because all of this is carried within me, within my body, within my stories in my family that get handed down every generation. We can trace where these symptoms of oppression that we are living out today and experiencing today came from. Like I said, referencing Columbus, or referencing even Sand Creek. So the Sand Creek Massacre happened just south of Denver, Colorado, and it's where the US military went in and massacred my people in the middle of winter while they were flying a white flag, thinking that they were there in peace and in truce. And there's stories and actual accounts from soldiers who refused orders, and they actually went and wrote letters to officers that were higher ranking than the officer that had ordered that. And in those letters, they talk about and reference the actual cutting out of babies from a mother's womb and beating the baby's brains in. And so there are actual accounts of those things that are going on. And that is just one massacre of thousands of those massacres that happened to the Indigenous people and the Native people of this land here. And so that's the military. That's the way it directly impacts me, and the way it directly impacts being a woman and being that identity. And so I think it's important to remember that and to carry that and to constantly be working to heal and to address and to prevent from future things happening, which we see continuously happening all over the world still to this day, as far as, sexual violence being used as a tactic by militaries. Also, just even my own personal experience. So like those are historical accounts, but my own experience of being sexually harassed, those impacts that I carry personally with acute trauma, and then historically from historical trauma, and then generational trauma that's handed down, are all reasons why I continue to like carry that lens and know that it's important to have that conversation around those intersections. The other one, just thinking about how, the second question is, can you share in what ways questions of gender justice are important in this work? and even just the title of this gathering being Feminist Leadership Against Militarism. And that's something that I'm constantly struggling with, because I, being a Native woman, have a hard time saying like I'm a feminist, and because a lot of the models that are presented, they don't include me. The definitions don't include me, the language doesn't include me, the way it's presented doesn't include me, or people that I represent oftentimes. And so even just looking at that, like we have certain cultural gender roles within my community and within my tribe. And there's stories and traditions about why things are the way they are. And we had complete societies and structures set up for a reason. And there was purpose around that, and that's how we existed since time immemorial. And we carry those stories still. And so it's hard to think about like being equal, because a lot of my teachings tell me that actually like women, because we give life, are actually held higher. And like we are actually held at a higher level because we do that. We go through that pain. We have that spiritual connection. And so for us to want equal rights is actually like taking a step backwards. So it's not then a matter of having equal rights. It's a matter of healing and decolonizing and stepping back into those teachings that we have had, in those roles that we have, and doing it in a healthy way that is not based in assimilation or colonization. Yeah.
Okay. I was like just nodding along all of everything that you said. Really resonated. I think also, stepping into our analysis as Gabriela USA is part of the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines. We do see how militarization, especially U.S. militarization, right, has deeply impacted the Philippines. And so we really see the root causes of all of the, different issues happening in the Philippines really stemming. We have an analysis on the 3 basic problems. The first basic problem is U.S. imperialism. The second is feudalism, marked by 300 years of being colonized by Spain. Once Spain left the Philippines, it doesn't mean that the 300 years, right, of the treatment that they had to the country ever left, just because they left. And then there's also bureaucrat capitalism. So how higher bureaucrat comprador families, so landlord-owning families, right? Folks who have the larger bank accounts, larger tracts of land, actually own land, can actually get their foot in the door to create political dynasties in the Philippines and continue in the corruption, the ongoing corruption, and how all 3 of those problems are, right, how they all enforce and support one another. And so we really see that work for the different organizations and for our movement is, as we're addressing one of the issues, we actually have to address all 3 issues, because we can't just want to have liberation for women without liberation for the indigenous people, without liberation for the workers, without liberation for the fisher folks or the peasant class in the Philippines, right? There are people in the Philippines who are born already locked into a system where they are tilling the land that they don't own and actually go into years and years of debt they'll never get out of, right? And so that still exists there. And so we see how all of those things are so intricate to society and how it also affects us as migrant Filipinos, right? We don't see ourselves disconnected from what's going on, what happened to generations before us in the Philippines, although we're overseas. We really see that migration for us does come from the lack of industry in the economy, right? If the economy is really built on the back of the poor and is really serving U.S. interests, then yes, there's not going to be jobs for the people there. And yes, we do have to go overseas to survive, right? It's a forced migration, although our families will say they're moving for a better life, right? That's the story, and that's that's the narrative that they'll carry to survive. And so as children of migrants, or as a child of migrants, that's really the the whole of our identity is not just in the culture here that we were raised in. It's in this hundreds and thousands of years of resistance, right? There's been resistance movements since even since the beginning of Spanish colonization. There's a long history of resistance, especially for Filipinos, and so we carry that with us, and we see that now it's not Magellan, right, coming into the country, but it's the U.S. Imperialism. It's the system that they've created and that we have to survive through, that we have to really analyze, but also to move forward is that we really have to come together. So that doesn't just mean like one sector of society pushing forward, right? It really means working together, not only with Filipinos, but in an international, with international solidarity, knowing that the liberation in one country like the Philippines will also help in the liberation of other countries. Therefore, really putting a blow on the octopus, right, of U.S. imperialism. And so really that's how we really see our role as Gabriela in the Philippines and outside of the Philippines, right, as a part of this greater internationalist movement. And so I think in terms of like questions about gender justice that we get, I think also, right, that ties into it in that it's not just for women or girls, right? But it's really for the liberation of all oppressed peoples. And that's where we really find the healing happening. Not in like the individualist kind of Band-Aid solutions or the solutions that were fed by multinational companies and like commercials on TV, right? But really it's in that bridging the individual with the collective. Really having that frame that it's not just for one or for the individual, but what we do as one really does support the greater. And that's as the individual to the collective, from the Philippines to all oppressed peoples, how that really is connected and yeah, yes.
Thanks. And so welcome, Leilani, and welcome, Bay Peace. We're really glad you're here. Yay. And so just want to give you a couple minutes here to talk a little bit about who you are and Bay Peace's work, and then if you want to reflect too on what the panelists have been talking about in terms of tonight's theme, feminist leadership against militarism, and what it means to you or to Bay Peace.
Cool. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us here, Adele. My name is Leilani. I'm the director at Bay Peace, Better Alternatives for Youth. We do youth organizing work in Oakland. And essentially what we do is empower youth to transform militarism and structural violence through arts, through liberation arts, through activism and community organizing, through leadership development, through vocational and like professional development, and also healing and transformation. And we work primarily with youth ages 13 to 21. And all of our staff are also, like, I'm the oldest staff, I'm only 25, and we have 3 other staff members, and all of them are also considered in the transitional age youth group. So we're a very youth-led organization. I don't do anything without their say-so. Every decision that I make is informed by their desires and needs and what they believe we need to be doing. And so we are working as a partner on the Drop the Mic campaign, primarily here in the Bay Area, alongside the Bay Area chapter of About Face Veterans Against the War. And so the way that our youth created this extension of the Drop the Mic campaign is by creating a community survey and doing research that gets a clearer idea of how young people are being impacted by issues related to militarism. They're also doing They do educational workshops, so there's a series of workshops that they do to unpack the intersectional and complex issues that fall under the umbrella of what's happening with militarism. So workshops on patriarchy and gender in regards to reproductive justice and LGBTQ justice. There's workshops on the school-to-prison pipeline on Islamophobia and the war on terror. There's a workshop on the school-to-prison pipeline and the militarization of schools. And there's a workshop on truth in recruitment. There's a workshop on, also, I think I'm missing a few more, borders and what's happening with like immigration issues. And then the last piece is an annual art presentation that they do. So last year they did, they created vignettes and they did theater skits that highlight scenarios of each issue, each intersectional issue. And this year they decided to do community-based art where they create a big community collage. They create a big painting and also a collective poem that's not just written by them, but that integrates stories and testimonies shared by community members during healing circles that we host. And I have flyers for folks. We're really interested in hearing voices and stories from community members who've been impacted by violence, different types of violence. So each art form is paired with a very specific type of violence, like community and state violence, police violence, and school violence. And so that's what they're working on now. The presentation is happening on May 10th. Yay, big gala and art presentation. So that's what we do. And so to these questions about gender justice with our work in feminist leadership and military, when I think about the issues in our society, one of the most prominent themes that I see in what's happening with the issue of militarism is how the dominant culture and ideologies and institutions that perpetuate militarism are built primarily by and for the benefit of white men. And this goes back and back, right, centuries to the very beginning of when the colonies were established and colonialism first began here in the U.S. and even around the world, right? Because it's a global issue. Militarism, imperialism is a global issue. And so what that means is that historically, in generations over time, the most historically disenfranchised groups within this patriarchal structure of militarism are youth, people of color, and women. Because now we are forced to be a part of these systems, but we didn't have very much say-so in the beginning, and even till now we don't have very much say-so. Youth aren't allowed to vote to help create the government and the structures that they have to abide by. There's hardly any women. Now there's the most women that there's ever been in the government now, but right, historically, women and people of color are the most underrepresented group in the government, in the House of Senate, right, the president. And so what that means for us is that, like, we have to do the best that we can to bring these voices to the foreground of the movement that's organizing in collaboration with allies who are a part of this system and who do have the power to make changes and make differences in the structure. We have to integrate their voices and uplift them and make sure that they're being in conversation with the people who do have power. So what that looks like for us is a lot of times we train our youth with, like, public speaking and in educational spaces for them to be able to go talk to city council members, to go talk to the Board of Education and advocate for themselves and what it is that they need in order for their future to be, in order for their future to just feel or to be set up in a way where they are no longer disenfranchised and they are able to build the agency that they need to be a part of these structures and for the structures to be inclusive of them. And we're not seeing that. And so a lot of times we have to be very creative in how we bring them into the conversation. So it's not just conversations in city council meetings and board meetings. A lot of times we use art, right? Because it's not only an institutional problem, it's a cultural problem. It's in how we think, how we talk, how we treat each other. So the art and the education and the conversation that in the community that we build the work that we do is being able to shift not only the institutions, but to be able to shift the culture and how people are thinking and interacting with each other and treating each other. And I think for, as women, as people who bring life to this earth, when I think about war, I think about destruction, massive destruction. But when I think about women, I think about massive creation, and I think about life. And that's similar to what I think about when I think of art and liberation art of what we do, is that counter to the destruction of militarism and violence and war is creativity, and it's life. And so that's why I feel it's important, the work that we do, not only as women in leadership, but also bringing youth to the center and helping them use art as a outlet and as a vehicle for change, is challenging the system of militarism with the exact opposite of creation. Whether it's art, whether it's conversation, community, healing, relationships, and yeah.
Thanks, Leilani. Thank you all. So this is a question for our speakers from About Face, Crystal and Brittany. So during the kind of most recent period of U.S. war making, we've seen a lift on the ban, I'm going to say kind of quote-unquote ban on women in combat roles. But simultaneously, women in the military have been subjected to high levels of sexual violence and really a culture of impunity around that violence, and then returned to a VA that is pretty poorly prepared to address the effects of sexual trauma. And this is just kind of one set of contradictions, right? I would like to hear from you about what contradictions we need to be paying attention to in that.
There's a huge and very intentional disconnect between people's awareness level of the size and significance of destruction that continues. The year I spent, I was in combat. I came back, and it was so strange because the debate about women. I think it was a senior. I'm trying to remember who suddenly issued basically a unilateral order that women were going to be allowed in combat roles, and suddenly all the military departments were reeling from that, and I was shocked. Even I was like, "Whoa, that happened," kind of out of nowhere, But people then were having intensely heated debates about whether or not women could be in combat roles. And it was fascinating to watch even people I had literally just spent time, not platoons I was literally in combat with, but people who were not in a situation with women in their platoon or in their unit, right? Debating heatedly whether these conceptual things, There were all of these people on the internet who genuinely believed that the reason that ban existed was because women couldn't be in austere environments for more than 3 days because they were more susceptible to infection because of having a vagina. And so I was just what do you think women did before modern running water and things like that? How do you think we operated? It's just such a bizarre thing to believe, and to watch these, all of these crazy stories come out of the woodwork that people genuinely, passionately believed, and that, women were too emotional, that women would be, too impacted by the violence, and we just had too delicate a sensibility. The reason I'm saying this is because the relevance, I think, is that those arguments are what push forward what we often, what's named on the agenda and kind of in the concept of imperial feminism, right? Which I think of as femme-identifying people, women looking to emulate patriarchal styles of leadership, right, in an effort to disprove those arguments, right? And I I think women in the military particularly, most social dynamics that play out in the military are an intense exaggeration of the oppressive systems that exist more broadly in society, right? And so it's almost useful, I think. There are really important stories to understand, particularly from people who are vets and service members who hold marginalized identities, because I think that there's a lot to learn about the exaggerated examples of the way that those things play out in order to be better at identifying the more subtle patterns in the way that they play out in, let's say, like corporate America, or even in the nonprofit industrial complex, right? And so I think that comes to mind when I think about what does it mean to look at these contradictions, right? Is that those contradictions often create a breeding ground for us to then, where liberation looks like emulating oppression, right? Oppressive leadership styles, oppressive value systems, right? Even the argument about women in combat roles, often the debate fell to physical violence, right? Like your ability to do physical violence. And I used to joke, and it's like so distasteful for me to think about now, but I used to joke like, well, if beating the Taliban comes down to me winning an arm wrestle, then we're screwed anyway. And think that that was hilarious because, but like the point stands, right? Is that like at the time, even though I had a really like imperialist and like messed up analysis and like really was gung-ho on doing my very best at emulating patriarchal leadership styles, I knew fundamentally that the value system was off, right? It didn't make any sense that my job was to be really smart and to connect to civilians at the time, to be able to understand, relate to, and build rapport with Afghan civilians was actually my job at the time. And yet, like, people were debating whether or not my ability to do whether I could do enough push-ups to like be able to be good at that job, you know? And so it was just like, it was so obvious that that was absurd, even living with a really messed up political analysis. And I think that is, I think that when we look at those contradictions within the military, we can extract and cross-apply the contradictions that we see in our own society, right? Where it's like bathroom bans meant to protect women and children, right? And that is prioritizing a way of understanding that is not actually liberatory, right? And that is actually based on a really messed up analysis, just like the contradictions of like putting more women into a system that is built around violence and then enables violence, and then, you know, all of the complications that come with that. I think, lastly, I'll say, so I feel a little lost in my own stories on this one, but I think the last thing is that it's important one, I mean, I guess I'll just end on the fact that like 1 in 3 women in the military has experienced sexual assault or harassment. 1 in 3. And what's frustrating as a woman who is in the military, like, is that that's used as an argument to also delegitimize your leadership, right? That's an argument for why you shouldn't have been there in the first place, which is like a whole nother level of victim blaming, right? But I think that that's another example, right, of like exaggerated patterns in a system that is an exaggerated version of the same problems that exist in society. And so I think that the last thing I'll say is that earlier when I talked about a definition of militarism, I talked about a system of values, right? And that one of those values is the prioritization of like your ability to do physical violence as strength, right? The conflation of physical strength and physical ability to do violence as strength. And I think that we see that show up in so many different ways. And I think that I will hand it off now, but that's, I'm a little lost in my thoughts on this one, but I think that that's like a hallmark that shows up across, when you look at the the intersections and the contradictions that Adele listed. I think that that's like a common value system and theme that brings clarity when you look at it through that lens.
Well, that's actually the perfect segue into what I was thinking about as far as a meaningful response to all of that. And to me, a meaningful response is value-based, right? It's based on our values as human beings and the identities and the experiences that we all carry. And just like looking back at some of the leadership values that Brittany and I have both identified and defined when we both took on the role of co-campaign directors for the Drop the Mic campaign, is really just around, we wanted to make sure that we are creating more than we are resisting and dismantling and fighting. And so, what Leilani mentioned, it really resonated with me in that, like, we have to continue to do that. And like one of my personal goals and focuses is to always be focused on like what I'm for, as opposed to what I'm against, because so much energy is always fed into what we're against. And to me, you don't move forward from that point. You're actually moving backwards from that point. And so constantly being aware of what we are for, what are we striving for, what are we creating, how are we creating that, and who are we including when we create that. And so to me, that's one of the values that we hold with the Drop the Mic campaign, but also, and I think it's a meaningful response. It's the way forward is gonna be grounded in that to me. And also looking at, like, one of the things that I always say when I work with a lot of Indigenous folks all over the world, because I'm a Native woman, and like their story is my story, and my story is their story. Their fight and their struggle is my fight and my struggle, and like our freedom, sovereignty, liberation, however you define that, is tied to one another. And most especially when our stories have the umbrella of oppression from militarism over them. And to me, that's really important to remember when we're moving forward. So as far as carrying meaningful responses, like, we have to do this together. Like, there's no way that we win. There's no way we all obtain our goals and our visions alone in silos. And we have to hold that, and we have to continue to carry that. Like, our liberation, sovereignty, freedom, however, is defined, and it's together. And so I think that's something that's really important. And it actually, when you're talking about militarism and imperialism, to me, it really resonates in carrying that value forward. The other thing, too, talking about, veterans organizing and how do we address militarism as veterans and within veteran communities without, dismissing veterans, without, being against veterans, without being against that, because we all exist in a country where there's like this big veteran mystique, right? And like, we honor veterans, we shake their hand, we buy them coffee, we offer them water, and like all of these things. But like, why? Like, what does that really mean? And so for those of us that question it and don't feel comfortable with that, it's easy for us to think about that. But I understand the complex dynamics that we exist in, where we don't want to disrespect veterans, because I come, like in my community, like I said, I come from a warrior culture, and so veterans in my community, being in the military was actually a way for us and our men to reclaim that warrior role that was stripped from us whenever we were put on reservations and whenever we were put under an IRA government. And so we jumped at the chance to be able to be warriors again and to be what we knew to be. And they took advantage of that, right? They actually enlisted us and recruited us specifically because of that. And we see that play out in the Middle East too, right? And so that happens in all of these other indigenous communities as well, as they take advantage of the fact that we are warriors, and that's what we identify with. But what makes that more difficult for me in the work going home, and I'm trying to talk about like anti-militarism and anti-war, when we have entire social events that are completely around upholding our veterans and acknowledging what they've done and the sacrifice that they've had. So it's really hard to talk about that, but I think one of the things that I hold and I try to have conversations around is like what I've called veteran privilege. And so I feel like as a veteran, and I actually encourage other veterans as well, is like we hold a certain privilege, we hold certain social capital within the United States, and then once we become politicized, and once we see the impacts, once we see how we were used as tools in imperialism, then it then becomes our responsibility to leverage that privilege and to bring these conversations up and to actually be the ones that address that, knowing the inner workings of the military, knowing viscerally what they do to us when they indoctrinate us, right? Like knowing what they do to us whenever they inject us with whatever they inject us with when we get shots and whenever we get medicine or whatever that they do. And so knowing that, like, it is our responsibility, and I think it is our job as veterans to leverage that privilege and to be able to, like, hold those values that I listed and more, obviously, that I don't have time to go over, but to hold those values and to continue to work with each other and to continue to work at these intersections of all of these other social justice movements and all of these other spaces where people are being oppressed and where people are being harmed. So I think those are what a meaningful response looks like, and that's just the start. I mean, there's more to it, obviously, but that's kind of where I start from and what I stay grounded in.
Thank you. So this is a question for Pixie. So during this period that the U.S. military has been making instrumental use of increasing numbers of women service members, military sexual trauma has been the subject of widespread coverage in the U.S. media in recent years, but women living with U.S. military installations in their communities have been making the connection between U.S. militarism and sexual violence for a very long time, and I think very striking examples from around the Pacific, but in Okinawa and the Philippines in particular. And so I just wanted to invite any reflection around how women's rights to safety have been effectively foregrounded in combating U.S. militarism and really organizing responses to U.S. military presence in the Philippines and building analysis around that.
Yeah, definitely. For Gabriela, in the Philippines, we're celebrating 35 years as an alliance this year, actually. And so there's an organization that's a part of Gabriela. They're called Lila Pilipina, and they're comfort women from World War II who've been organizing for years. And right now, of course, as they're getting older, the members are passing, but there's still a few who are active. And whenever I'm able to go to the Philippines and to go organize with Gabriela in the Philippines, they're really the folks that you really see on the street whenever we have mobilizations or rallies. They're really out there, although, taking into consideration their health and their needs and things like that. It's really a testament to the grounding of our campaigns against U.S. militarization and U.S. militarism in the Philippines, but also globally, right? In terms of having military presence in communities, and so they themselves have made the connections of in the past, right, with Japanese occupation, but now with de facto colonization of the Philippines to the U.S. And so that being, one of our foundational campaigns, and even carrying it here in San Francisco in particular, right? There's even a struggle in getting the Comfort Women Monument up in St. Mary's Square that has been the Comfort Women Coalition has been working on it for years and years. But even now that it's already up, there's still ongoing debates, and there's still struggles in terms of wanting it getting taken down, and even the struggle just putting it back up. And then there's also monuments that tie into that in the Philippines, in Korea as well. And the sister statue in the Philippines was taken down only a few months after it had been put up. And the reason the reason for taking it down in a public park where it was set up is that they had to work on sewer pipelines. And so that's the story that they sold to the media, and why they had to take down that monument there that the Comfort Women Coalition has been working so hard for. And so connecting that to the militarization and that's happening today, we're really seeing that there are ongoing issues, right? So one of the bigger campaigns that we had that was very visible, and especially close to my heart, because it was when I really started organizing with Gabriela, is the Justice for Jennifer Laude. campaign that we carried out with Jennifer Laude's family. Jennifer Laude was a trans Filipina who was murdered by a U.S. serviceman, Pemberton, who was in the Navy. And so he had murdered her in a hotel room and then blamed that they didn't know that they were trans, and so that was the reasoning that they gave. And so there was a big fight in terms of not only, especially in the culture in the Philippines, right, that's still very much like governed by feudal patriarchy. Just even, right, having a trans Filipina in the news and really respecting who they are and their identity in terms of making sure that the story was told correctly. And so there was there's that battle in itself. And then there was the battle to actually have him be tried in the custody of the Philippines. And so there was a really long struggle in that he was actually held by the U.S. Navy for, I want to say, the duration of the trials, and even afterwards. And so we're really seeing that even thinking about how can we move forward, how can we really address our the sovereignty, right, of the country if there's already going to be these very limited ways that we can really try and resolve problems that happen in the country itself. And then also there was a massacre in Mama Sapano with indigenous peoples, and coming out in a fact-finding mission that there was actually presence of U.S. military there during the massacre in itself, and that getting covered up in the media and having a media blackout of it. So on the front lines, we're really trying to not only address the truths and address what's really going on the ground, but also try and really care for the communities that we have there. So one of the really amazing phenomenon that we're seeing is we partnered with 1 Billion Rising, started by Eve Ensler and Susan Swan from V-Day. And so once we partnered with them and also created just addressing the violence against women happening, but through a creative means, so through dance and through song. We saw the response in that it became a phenomenon there. So you're having whole universities out dancing and speaking out against violence against women, speaking out against militarization happening in their communities. And now even with more and more outright comments, right, like macho fascist comments coming from President Duterte, the response in terms of the combating his just, it's the most ridiculous things you could say, you could come up with the most ridiculous things. For example, shooting a rebel woman in her vagina. That's what the Philippine army should do, because then it would warrant her useless. Or that a rape of, there was a missionary who was killed and raped, and then he made some lascivious comments around him being, he should have been the first one. So these horrible comments, right? And not just on the side or not in secret, those secret tapes or people it's really him on the podium. It's him in Malacanang Palace, which is the White House. And it's his press secretaries afterwards trying to apologize and say, oh, he was just kidding. That's not really what he meant to say. Don't interpret it the wrong way. He was making a joke. And so it's really this culture that we're really trying to combat. And so another one of the campaigns that we started to really gather support internationally and nationally in the Philippines was Babae Ako. So the hashtag I think it was 2018 where it just went viral in the Philippines, and like mothers, grandmothers were sharing because having access to like a phone is also like a cultural phenomenon happening now. But just really seeing how the ways that we address the trauma that's happening and the sexual violence in ways that also take care of our communities is possible, and to really address what are really the concerns and issues is also possible. Not having to skirt around language or what's really going on and like trying to like navigate those things, but being very honest in what's happening has been really positive.
Thank you. So I have one more question for Leilani and Bay Peace, and then I want to make time to hear questions from students and community members, and then also from the youth leaders who are here from Bay Peace. They have some activities set up for us. So your work is about engaging young people in building alternatives to militarism. And we just saw an uprising of teachers, who are, of course, are mostly women workers, and Oakland public school students, who are mostly youth of color, against austerity during the Oakland teacher strike. And this is happening during a time when our federal government is talking about slashing spending in the federal education budget and spending money, militarizing our border with a useless border wall. And so I'm wondering how you and the young people you work with are doing the work of making the connections between militarism and the changes you want to see in the community, and really engaging in this moment, and what it's like to build those conversations with other young people in the schools. So that's for you or for any of the youth leaders who are here too.
Cool. So we actually had a conversation about this on the way over here, and what I did was I just like wrote down all the things that they mentioned in our conversation. So all of what I'm about to say comes from basically what they shared with me. And so what's happening with OUSD, the Oakland Unified School District right now, between this year and next year, they're in a $90 million deficit. In addition to that, teachers went on strike for about a week and a half, and a few of their demands were a 12% increase in teacher salaries, smaller student classrooms, no school shutdowns, and mind you, there's about 8 schools that the district proposed to close, 8 school shutdowns, and also laying off a number of staff and programs that target minority students. So cutting things like a PISA, making cuts to African American male achievement programs, things like that. And so in addition to that, a lot of students also started organizing to make similar demands that would also benefit students. And so some of the things they were asking for were for more like health counselors, mental health counselors, and career readiness services. And so for us, a lot of what we're seeing is that there's an issue of funding and resources. And the state of education is in a national crisis, not just here in Oakland or San Francisco, but nationally. We have one of the worst education systems in the world. So if we look at at a federal level, the federal government has allocated over $800 billion to military spending. And for the the spending of education, they're only allocating like between $50 and $60 billion. So already we see where the priorities and what the government values before our children and before our students, right? And so if we look at state spending, in the last 20 years, 16 prisons have been built and only 4 universities. And every day, the state spends 3 or 4 times more on people who are incarcerated in juvenile detention facilities than they spend on students in classrooms. And now, when we look at it locally with what's happening in Oakland, it's like a trickle-down effect, right? It's like a given of how the values are being perpetuated from the federal government and down to the local government. And so in OUSD, we're also one of the only schools that have contracts with the police department and even with the DEA. And so these contracts were supposed to support the budget of OPD because they also had a deficit. So it was to support the budget of the OPD and with what's happening with the DEA to try to like crack down on what's happening with drugs and things that they believe are happening in schools, yeah? And so it brings us to the question of like the state of schools and how schools are being militarized, right? Both through profiling, through policing, through recruitment, very targeted recruitment, and the way students are surveilled in schools, which this issue perpetuates the school to prison pipeline and further perpetuates the disenfranchisement of low-income youth of color. And so like, the school's education is like another form of indoctrination, right? And if we think about it, almost every single person in this room, every single person in this country goes through 12 or more, if we are in college, 12 to 20 years sometimes if you become a PhD student, you go to through this many years of indoctrination that tell you how to think, how to be, how to believe, which it normalizes authoritarianism. And it normalizes punishment and complacency, especially when we're looking at K through 12 schools. And so for us, Bay Peace was born out of the anti-recruitment movement because what was happening that our co-founders saw during the height of the war in Iraq right after 9/11 was that recruiters started hitting schools really heavy, especially schools that had a lot of low-income students of color. And it was very targeted recruitment. And what our youth were saying was that, the military, joining the military is very appealing. I consider the military. We have a few youth in our programs that also are considering the military up until we tell them about the truth in recruitment, right? Because as young people of color who grow up in poverty, who grow up accustomed to violence, not only at home, not only in the media, not only in our communities, in our streets, in our classrooms, and with what we see with the agenda of the government, right? The military becomes appealing because there's so many benefits associated with it, right? Like, oh, get money for college, oh, get money to buy a house, oh, travel the world, get out of this place that you've been in with your family for so long, that's the gutter and it's the mud and it's the deep, right? And so because they become so, like, the system of education and all that's happening with their disenfranchisement makes them so vulnerable to become accustomed to violence, not just being appealing to join the military, but also to fall into a lifestyle of violence, right? A lot of us have family members who have been incarcerated because they've been in gangs, who have lost their lives because they were shot, or lost their lives because, or are suffering a lot of mental health and physical abuse because of the violence that's happening in their homes, yeah? And so the work that we do in relating to what our community wants to see, like, we're currently in this sort of incubation period for our organization where we're literally institutionalizing the things that the community wants to see. Because before we can do all of the work out there and for everybody else, we have to know how to do it for ourselves and with ourselves. So this is only the second year that our organization is fully youth-led. Previously, it was led by our co-founder for 10 years, and she was the full-time volunteer. But she was an elder white woman, and she came from a very different community than all of us came from. And so there's this shift happening in our organization where now everything that we do and implement and embody is fully from the people who are being the most impacted by militarism. And so our hope is that in being able to institutionalize the things that our community wants to see with our organization, it'll then become easier for us to perpetuate it and support our allies and our community members in also being able to perpetuate it, because we practice it, we embody it, and we've been through the experience of going through that anguishing transformation, right? This anguishing transformation, because the healing work and that transformation, the liberation, it's not easy work. But once we get through it, we think we could do a lot better in serving our community members and making that change. So like with the workshop series that we do, it gives every single community member a voice and agency, and being able to develop a more collective, community-oriented, and empathetic understanding of how we need to be operating, so that we can begin to shift the culture of militarism and shift the culture of violence, yeah? And so even like the vocational training that we do, like our interns organize events, they're doing research, and so they're learning how to sift through data, they're learning how to do outreach, how to do public speaking, how to facilitate, how to educate people. And so that vocational training, and they get paid for this work. Not only do they get school credit, but we also pay them to do this work so that they can see doing this work as a viable opportunity beyond the militarism that's not just about the money. Like, the money's here, you will be rewarded, but it's also meaningful work. It's meaningful work that not only benefits you, but that benefits the entire community and benefits society. Yeah, so our hope is like to begin to shift their thinking and knowing that there are other opportunities that you can do that can sustain you and help like get you to a higher level of success, but that also like it can be meaningful, and it doesn't have to just be about you. It can be about all of us. Like, we can uplift others along as uplifting ourselves. And the cultural work that we're doing, too, with the arts and the education is really, like, to shift how people treat each other and how people act. And our hope is that, you know, as we begin to train youth to do this, that then this will become the dominant culture and this will become the dominant ideology and way of being as they begin to take over the systems that we're critiquing and that we're challenging.
Thank you so much. So can we give all of our speakers another hand before we move to the next one? Thank you for everything that all of you just brought. And so we have time to take a couple questions, and out of respect for the program that the Bay Peace youth leaders have prepared, I want to keep Q&A short, but want to see if anyone has some questions that you have to continue to draw out the wisdom of our speakers today. Sure.
Hi, my name's Edward Hasbrook. I'm with the War Resisters League, and my background is in the draft resistance movement. And you alluded to the fact that the opening of women to combat to women has undermined the legal basis for requiring only men and not women to register for the draft. And as a result of that ruling, which was people knew was coming, but it only happened 2 weeks ago, there's now debate, and Congress is going to have to be forced to make a decision either to get rid of the failed draft registration program that had been running for the last 35 years, or double down on its failure by expanding it to women. And there already is, it was appointed 2 years ago, and it's been working very quietly until recently when people finally noticed, a National Commission on Military Service that's going to be holding hearings, 2 days of hearings next month in Washington, on whether to end draft registration or extend it to women. And the discourse has all been in those terms that you alluded to, Brittany, of equality meaning being part of the patriarchy. And people like Nancy Pelosi and Jackie Speier, who've been leading the push for requiring women to register for the draft, are being seen as the feminist voice. There's been a complete absence of anti-war feminist voices in that discussion. You know, I've been invited to testify because of my background, but they haven't invited any anti-war feminists. They haven't invited, you know, any draft age women. So I just want to throw that out to folks. If you have anybody in your networks who can be in Washington April 24th, 25th, they're actually going to have some open mic time. You can also do stuff online. But I guess my question would be, in light of the kinds of arguments that you were making, if you had a chance to talk to Pelosi, to Speier, to the National Commission on Military Service, what would you want to say to them about the idea of trying to force women, along with men, into the military through a draft? Or should they get rid of draft registration, and why?
I think that this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Around what does winning look like and what does liberation look like? Does liberation look like women equally having access to murder black and brown people around the world for the sake of empire? I don't think that that's probably what we meant when we said feminism and liberation and gender equality, right? I think that the argument needs to be made that the draft should be abolished completely, right? I think that unfortunately this is where we get into an issue where the mainstream left in this country either, I don't know, I won't say never was, but has certainly forgotten it was supposed to be the anti-war wing of politics, right, in American society. And the sad fact is even the legacy of the radical movements in the 60s and 70s against the wars, the stories about that have been completely whitewashed. And it's the story that's told now, right, is that like, there were these hippies, and they were like spitting on soldiers and calling them baby killers, and the soldiers were like, you're a jerk, I was just serving my country, and now we're like, that's why we say thank you for your service. That's wildly untrue about the conditions that were happening at that time. That leaves out the legacy of dozens and dozens of GI, or soldier, airman, naval, right, societies that were built around resisting the Vietnam War, that straight up, like on ground in Vietnam, refused to carry out orders because they were like, this war is racist, it's immoral, and we're not participating in it anymore. And like literally drove the entire military to a halt, to where they had to shift to an air-based war because they could no longer trust their land-based companies to fight, right? An entire company of black GIs breaking out of a prison in Vietnam and revolting, right? Like, these things have been completely whitewashed out of the legacy, right? That Muhammad Ali was jailed, stripped of his titles for saying that the Vietnam War was racist. It was out of line with black liberation struggle that was happening at the time. It was out of line with Chicana movements and with, all of these other amazing gender movements that were happening, right? Like, all of these arguments that were made that are completely wiped out of our legacy, that over 500,000 GIs marched and went AWOL because they were refusing to participate in the war. It was veterans and GI who led that movement, and I think that connects to what has to happen now, right? It has to be veterans leading the charge because we have privilege, but it has to be in a way that is not riddled with the imperialism and whiteness of the legacy of those movements, right? And the difference is that we have a responsibility to create a stage and give it away to Yemeni people, to Afghan people, to indigenous people, right? To create a platform so that those voices that are so often also written out of the legacy of what US militarism actually is have an opportunity to come forward. And connecting the dots between the fact, like, the left has, instead of countering nationalist narratives and nativist narratives, right, or the like prioritization of like, don't get mad at me, but like the frankly Bernie narrative of like America first, but like the friendly leftist way, right? Which is like, we shouldn't do business with companies that like around the world that can't pay this amount because immigrants are here to take your job, right? Anyway, sorry, I'm getting onto a sidetracked point, but like the point is that the left, instead of countering those narratives, has adopted a leftist version of them, right? And is like, we're gonna wave the flag because we're afraid of being called not patriotic when we challenge those things. And what we have to step into is a new wave that is deeper than that and that is more critical than that. And I think we're seeing that now. I think we're seeing amazing voices step forward and challenge that imperialism on the left. And it's time for us as movement leaders in racial justice, gender justice, environmental justice movements to make sure that we bring that piece of the lens forward and build our bench of people who are completely disconnected from any connection with military life, right? To feel comfortable talking about those things. Because that's the gap, right? I think a lot of people are like, there's a whole set of landmines around talking about patriotism and the military, and I don't know what's okay to say, and people don't feel comfortable. Our bench of people who have that analysis with some level of nuance and comfort level is shallow on the left, and that's a thing that I think we have to work on. And it has to be grounded, coming back to your question, is in the analysis that no one should ever be forced to kill for the government, period. Like, the equality should be that no one is forced to, not that everyone is able to be forced to. And I also would add that in challenging the draft, we should also be challenging mandatory deployment. because that is another mechanism, right? I think that one of the subtle things that undermines our push for universal health care and universal college education, free college, right, is that those are the best recruiting tools that the military has right now. Right? It's called, the poverty draft is not a new phrase. And that's also why we have to be more nuanced in our criticism of militarism, right? It's not just like all people who join the military are assholes, right? Because that lacks a systemic analysis of why people join, right? And most people, it's not because they want to go they want to go kill people. It's because they want access to the resources. They want access to, improve their social status. They want access to respect, to be treated with respect in a society that glorifies that, right? All of those things. And I know I'm going long, but I also think that people need to understand, right? Like, I signed a contract when I was 17 that I wouldn't be out of until I was 30, right? And so, refusing to participate in a war is no longer part of the, people barely even know that conscientious objection exists as an option now, right? And that's where you can say, I don't want to participate in this because I'm against all war. But I shouldn't have to say I'm against all war in order to say, I don't believe in this war you're fighting, and I'm not going to go fight in it for you, right? Like, that should be an option. And to say that you don't have an option for that, I don't think should be legal either. And I think that it's time for us to push the envelope on what the government should be allowed to make people do, regardless of what contract they signed. And I'll leave it with, you shouldn't have to sign up to kill for the government in order to get free college, period.
So I just want to say for students in the room, maybe this is also a plug for in 2020, we're going to have on the ballot a charter amendment to potentially make free city college a permanent part of what the city of San Francisco funds. So we have free college here at City College for SF residents. We want it to be for everyone. Right now it's for SF residents. But just to put in context the importance of that work and that campaign, right? So, yeah. I see one more hand, and then we'll hear from Bay Peace.
Yeah, sure. Hi, so I'm Brian Daly, a student here on campus. I also work with SMAC and a few other groups. So my question kind of touches on a lot of the things that you alluded to. The fact that, people from black and brown spaces are kind of elicited to the poverty draft, and they step into the military looking for resources. Is there any space for these people to kind of keep their identities and step into these institutions that have been used for destabilization and kind of reform them to help navigate them towards nation building and to help build these nations that have been living under imperialist systems to build themselves into their own nation in less bloody means? We were just talking about Vietnam. That's a very poignant example. If somebody was there to help build Vietnam towards the nation that it wanted to be, as opposed to sending black and brown bodies in there to be decimated, the military would look a lot different. So is there any space for black and brown people to step in and, directing this question to people who have served, is there any space for maybe more liberal-minded folks to step in and help navigate the military towards reform? Because it is one of the biggest arms of our government.
Hi, thanks for your question. I felt like I was itching off my seat because I feel really strongly, I feel a very strong response to this question. A lot of what we try to encourage our students to do is educate themselves and prepare themselves for leadership, right? So not only in community spaces, but for institutional spaces. So when a student tells me they want to go into politics, when a student tells me they want to go be a lawyer, when a student goes to tell me that they want to be something or do something that puts them in the position within these institutions that perpetuate systemically racist policies and ways of operating, I encourage them to do it, and I turn them to resources that'll better equip them with the knowledge and the skills to take these seats. Because for me, we can't beat a system that you don't know how to operate, right? A lot of what we've been doing the fight for generations over time, the past, like, right beginning of the civil rights movement, it's been about attacking the government from the outside. It's about critiquing them. It's about telling them and yelling at them and agitating them and screaming at them and letting them know that a change needs to happen. But it's happening from the outside. But the thing is, they're so strong in resources and historically like ideologies, right? This system is already built up like so sturdily and rooted that it's been hard to change it and transform it. So for me, what I believe is that if we can meander our way into these systems, I tell my students, you can't learn how to beat a system if you don't know how to work it. So I tell my students, I encourage them to learn how to work these systems, learn how to operate within it, so that once you get inside, then you put yourself in a position with agency to then transform it, right? So that the fight is happening both which ways, and it's not just this, we gotta knock on the door, right? We were trying to bang on the door, change, and they got these vaults and these systems and these walls built up so strongly. No, we're coming from the inside out now, so we can see from every which way how to make the difference, yeah? So that's my take on it.
So all of that. And so I always get into these conversations with people in different spaces about like fixing this system or whatnot. And like, I really don't think that this system is broke. I actually think the system that we live in is actually working very effectively and efficiently at what it was designed to do. And so I don't believe in like participating in that system to try to fix it. But I do think in like reforming, and I also think like someone had presented to me before as far as like harm reduction. So like our communities are experiencing very real things, real time, right now. And so I think that when it comes to like that system and our participation in it, I think we can actually create space for people to reduce the amount of harms that our communities are feeling right now. And I think that is the extent of what we're actually going to be able to do within that system. But I think I also work with youth, so I have like several different hats that I carry at any given time. But one of the other things that I do is work with youth in my community. And one of the things that I do encourage them on is focusing on what we would like to see in place of that. So when we win, what does that look like? And are we actively creating that right now? Instead of trying to dismantle this, or instead of trying to fix this system over here that is working fine, and it is upholding what it was designed to uphold, but are we expending our energy on that, or are we expending our energy on actually creating those, what we would like to see, that are rooted in who we are as peoples, whatever community that you come from and represent.
I know we're short on time and I've said a lot, but I had to say this. I think that there's a huge, one thing that I don't think you can understand until you have participated in the institution that is the military and war. Which is that, like, I signed up with a little bit of the mentality that you're talking about, right? Is like, if only neoconservative crazy people join the military and it's an inevitable institution, then it's always gonna be the worst case version, right, of what it could be. And I was like, I'm gonna be a good leader and change things for the better, you know. I think what I couldn't have understood at that point is is a little bit of what Crystal is talking about, right? Which is the like power and effectiveness of that machine, and how much momentum is behind it, and that fundamentally you are a warm body. Right, like you are a warm body that is part of that machine, no matter how great and liberal or whatever, right, a reformist of a leader you are. I'm still participating in training soldiers to take lives, right? I'm still participating in training soldiers to dehumanize scared brown people. I'm still, you know, and so like I could not have understood going into that the cost to my soul. You know, like that's, you don't know, like you can't, you know, and that's something that I think is really hard to communicate to people, is the question, there's all this language and really exciting advertising and all of this stuff, all these like special jobs, like, oh, I'm just gonna sit and like work on the cybersecurity, right? And like all these ways that they make it seem like you're not part of a force that is fundamentally designed to kill people, but you are, right? Like whatever your job is in that. And I would argue that because of the power of that system, that our liberation energy is better spent educating our people about the truth of what that is, reclaiming our resources from that system to put them towards systems that are building up power, right, and building up education and health and all of these things, and supporting the healing of people who have been indoctrinated into that system to come out of it and to be restored and to heal and to make amends for what they've participated in. And yeah, sorry, I'll stop there.
So in the spirit of visioning alternatives, I want to invite up Bay Peace to lead us in our closing activities with Leilani. But let's give another round of applause to our speakers for tonight.
Cool. So I'm going to invite my youth leaders up here to rock the sort of stage with me. And we're gonna do a couple quick, brief activities. These are little snippets from our Drop the Mic workshops. Don't be shy, y'all. Come on, step into your power. Come on up. Let's give them a warm welcome to the stage. So we're gonna do a quick energizer just to wake your game up. So can everybody stand up out their seats really quick?
All right, y'all. My name is Marcos, and the reason we do energizers is to build presence with everybody, and just build energy, build a community. So right now we're gonna do this thing called Shake Off. Y'all know what that is? Y'all played that before? No? So as you can tell, the name is pretty self-explanatory. You shake off. So we're gonna start from 5. We go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then we go down. So 4, 3, 2, 1, just so on, so on.
4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
We get faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
Right? Ready? Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Wait. We all gotta say it. We all gotta count down together. Okay? Wake your game up. Okay. Sorry.
All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 4, 3, 2, 1. 4, 3, 2, 1. 4, 3, 2, 1. 4, 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 1, 1.
All right, y'all can sit down now. My name is Maria, and right now we're gonna do a quick word cloud on the word militarism and what you think about militarism when you hear the word. But the reason we're gonna do it is because everyone in this room have a different opinion and a different understanding of militarism. So if you guys could give me some words and that pop up in your head when you hear this word, and Leilani, she's gonna help me out by writing them down on the board. So could we get some words, please?
Violence.
Violence. You said what?
Forceful.
Forceful.
Death.
Death. Anything else?
Patriotism.
Patriotism. Fear.
Nationalism.
Nationalism.
Pervasive.
Pervasive. Some good words.
Destruction.
Okay.
Separation.
Separation.
We'll do that next.
You guys have it? Any more words? Police. Can you repeat that? Exploitation.
Power.
Yeah.
Power.
Rape.
Rape.
Money.
I heard
What's the one
missiles.
over here?
I heard missiles.
Missiles?
I believe I heard
Is
that.
that what it was?
Control. Someone put control.
Control?
Okay.
Sexism.
Could we get like 2 or 3 more, please?
Money.
Mm-hmm.
Transphobia.
Abuse. What was the other one? Transphobia.
Okay, so The words that we have up here is fear, nationalism, pervasive destruction, separation, police, rape, money, power, exploitation, sexism, control, forceful, violence, abuse, death, transphobia, and patriotism. Is there anything that you guys feel like is missing? Resistance and white supremacy. Thank you. So what is something that you see in all these words that we have up here that, what do you see that's in common? Can you repeat that? Whoever said that? Hate. Oh, hate. Domination. Oppression. Anything else? Okay, so now I'm gonna hand it over to Anna, and she's gonna explain the definition of militarism to you guys.
Thanks, Maria. My name is Anna, and today I will be explaining to you guys the definition of militarism. And it is a system of political and social philosophies that prioritizes and glorifies the expansion and aggressive use of state violence to further state interests. A culture embracing militarism is often marked by passive belief in the intrinsic value or necessity of war, prioritizing of military practices, values, and knowledge, and powerful national mythology that centers military success. So basically, to summarize all of this, it's basically a government or people who want to maintain power in the military. Yeah. Does anyone have like, did anyone like get any words that pop out to them when they see this, or any phrases that pop out to them? Aggressive. And why does that pop out to you? Why did that stand out to you? It's negative. Okay. Anyone else? Mythology. Why did that stand out to you?
Because it's like stories based on falsehood.
Okay, stories based on falsehood. Yes.
The thing that popped out to me was state interest, because I was sort of curious about what makes something a state interest instead of not.
Okay, so what makes something a state interest? Yes.
Along with mythology, passive belief, that it's like enough for it to be passive. You don't have to put that much effort into it to
Okay. Yes. Okay. And you?
Yeah, I think that in the beginning that military was created to protect white people. And it's funny in the beginning that they continue the generation to generation that.
Okay.
So expansion, could that be considered expansion, like just for them? Like
So which word would you choose?
Expansion. Okay.
Expansion and construction.
Okay. And one more? Yes.
Necessity.
Necessity. Okay. And do you know why that stood out to you?
Because it goes along with the word that Kat pointed out, mythology.
Mythology.
Mythology that military might is a necessity.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
Cool, thank you everybody. So this is the definition that About Face developed for Drop the Mic. And this is the definition we take into the classrooms with students as young as 13, 12 years old, all the way up into, like, you know, we build really intergenerational spaces as we see here and with our partners through About Face. And so because militarism is such a big, complex, intersectional issue, it's so long. The definition is so long. But yeah, so you can find more information about militarism in the Drop the Mic tour on the About Face website, and also about what we're doing here in the Bay Area on the Bay Peace website, baypeace.org, and AFVAW.org. Aboutfaceveterans.org. Cool. Thank you, everybody. So we just want to close out with a quick performance that myself and our youth staff put together. This is a work in progress. It's in development, and it's something that we're developing. This is our sort of like first public run through, and that we hope to build to perform as a masterpiece at our final event on May 10th. So bear with us. It's a work in progress. Attend hut!
Police, a civil force of a national or local government responsible for the prevention and detection of crime and maintaining public order. Loud knocks hit the door of my apartment. Loud voices yelled and yelled.
Policía, abre la puerta. Police, open the door.
Men in blue marched across my living room, carrying metal lead pipes, whispering death. Door after door slammed.
Waging war was too easy. All these years of conflict, wars that only held one enemy topic and no remedy tactic. But classifying our rivals has led us to lose. Gunboat diplomacy, which dismisses democracy, only blossomed abuse. Remember the staging of coups around the globe who will push our do's and don'ts? Same ones ordering children for war who have yet to interpret their own world? California, outdated curriculum, left out a lot. From genocide, racism, my past, present, and future. But militarism always took the plots of heroes and humanitarian leaders, while bandits, toy soldier, addicts, and rapists and illiterate had available casting for the masses.
They got money for wars but can't feed, house, or adequately educate our people. $800 billion already, but for so many years in a row got the nerve to ask for more. While they slowly pick away at programs for the elderly and the poor, instead of loving its consumption. Extracting Mother Earth for all her elements, building worldwide settlements, flying in the sky, floating in the ocean, all the time, anywhere there's some kind of violent commotion. Occupying TV screens, our minds, our homes, and our streets like this forever creeping culture vulture. It's what they push for the toys of young boys. Or mistake for, in the hands of an innocent black man, is persecution on sight. Laws, borders, and surveillance established every which way, everywhere in plain sight. Man, they really weren't lying when they pledged from sea to shining sea.
The fear of being separated ran through my head from my siblings and my pops. Handcuffs wrapped around the wrists of my moms and pops, questioned like if they were criminals. Hablas inglés, hablas inglés. Do you speak English? Heroes turn to villains in the blink of an eye.
Turn on your TV screen and you will see politicians on comedy segments, all playing oblivious to the steady rise of crime, but being infatuated on chasing another buck. Had them prioritizing urban shields, sealing prison deals, corporate occupation, and recruiters dealing counterfeit diplomas. While empty school halls, homeless reservations, and PTSD, population steady lost stability. Monday and Tuesday, they declared war. Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, ask Gaza, Honduras, and everyone else. But Saturday and Sunday, they still had the audacity to put a press conference and go to church and plead for forgiveness.
See, for generations over time, they've been programming our minds, exploiting our bodies, hours for some dollars, overworking us so we're too tired, charging taxes, tolls, tickets, and fines, hypnotizing us into consumerist schemes, fooling us with commercials so we believe that happiness and satisfactions are things that we can buy. Then save up all the profits to cover up their tax docs and court lies. See, the war field looks a little different now. They got teams in dark rooms with headsets and computer lights, controllers in their hands, the whole gang counting down for drones and bombs to take flight. While they distract us with the bombardment of irrelevant headlines and expect us to sit down, just listen and be quiet. But this right here, this is how we break free. This right here, this is how we stand up. And this right here is how we fight for better rights.
See, I don't
I
even
can't
know
believe
why
they've
you
been doing
tripping.
this.
Man,
Generation
you better
to
bring my
generation
folks.
to
You better
generation
bring
to
them. I
time.
tell you,
My
you better bring
grandmother,
them.
my grandfather, my tatai, my nana, they were smart to get here. And it was through the
Like, for real,
military.
it's our duty
But
to
they
fight
tried their
for
best.
freedom. They tripping. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and protect each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
I do just want to give a quick invitation to folks to be a part of our community and join our circulos, our healing circulos. We're having a series of them focused on community and state violence, police violence, and school violence. We'll be transforming everybody's testimonies and stories into collages, paintings, and poetry. So if you have been impacted by any form of these violences, or if you have a strong opinion and vision for how we want to challenge and resist this type of violence, please come to our circulos. Our youth are going to be facilitating them. Our youth literally thought up and created this project, and will also be creating the artworks and presenting them. So I have flyers if anyone might be interested. It'll the first one is on Monday. So yeah, hopefully y'all come out Monday the 18th. All right. Thank you so much, Adele, for having us.
So please be sure to check out the lid table to hear updates from the organizations and speakers from today. Also, if you can fill out your eval forms for concert and lecture, they helped bring these amazing speakers here today. Women 54 students, you can leave your note cards up here for me. And let's thank again Bay Peace, About Face, Veterans Against War, and Gabriella USA, all our speakers today for coming out.
I also just wanted to mention a form went around that was a pledge form. If you're interested in getting involved with the campaign, there's a half sheet there that you can fill out your information, and we'll add you to our list where we're sending out organizing information and continuing to build momentum. We also have a Drop the Mic open mic tomorrow where you can hear more amazing performances like what we just heard, and just socialize with other people who want to get involved in anti-militarism organizing, whether that's specifically in Drop the Mic or just bringing that lens to other spaces and other movements that you care about. As well as we'll be participating in the March for Fossil Fuel Freedom, which is an Indigenous-led march, and doing some discussion about militarism there, so feel free to sign up and join us. And then Sunday, an organizing meeting, which I plead and invite all of you to come to, especially because that's where we want to talk about next steps and what it looks like to build momentum together in the Bay Area with folks who live here, who are chapter members of About Face here, as well as many other amazing allies who are doing that work every day. And lastly, on that pledge form, there's also a place where it says, I pledge, blah, blah, blah. I know it's cheesy, but we want to get the word out to other people. And so if there's a way that you can think about how you might want to incorporate that lens into your everyday work, even if it's just like think about militarism more often or sign up for the campaign, if you could write that and take a selfie, if you tag us, the social media tag is on there, we will retweet you and boost that post and share that, and would love to have y'all participate in that tonight and share that folks have participated and are continuing to become part of that work. So, and there's free stickers.